The story of India's partition doesn't begin in 1947. It begins much earlier, perhaps the moment the British East India Company planted its flag in Bengal in 1757. Over the next century, they extended their grip over the subcontinent, forging a strange and complex unity out of diversity. India, this sprawling mosaic of languages, customs, religions, and kingdoms, became, in British eyes, a single jewel in the crown of the empire. But that jewel, polished by British railways, telegraphs, and bureaucracy, concealed fractures too fine to see until pressure made them split. Villages with Hindu and Muslim neighbors who had shared festivals and water wells for generations suddenly found themselves suspicious of each other. The reasons were manifold. British administrators governed with an aloof detachment, favoring divide-and-rule methods that emphasized difference over commonality. Census categories rigidified fluid identities. Political representation was broken down by religious electorate. Slowly, Indians started seeing one another not merely as neighbors, but as members of separate, competing communities. And then there was the issue of power. For centuries, Muslims had ruled vast stretches of India, from the Delhi Sultanate to the Mughal Empire. But with the coming of the British, and the decline of Muslim political clout, a new class of educated Hindus began to rise, particularly in the professions, in government, in business. A quiet anxiety grew among many Muslims. In a democratic India, would they be outnumbered, outvoted, and erased? Yet in the early 20th century, the dream of unity still flickered. The Indian National Congress, formed in 1885, welcomed people of all faiths under one nationalist banner. But beneath the speeches and slogans, tensions brewed. The Congress was dominated by elite, mostly Hindu leaders. Muslim participation was modest, and the fear of being sidelined grew. In 1906, the All India Muslim League was formed, initially to protect Muslim rights, not to divide India. But the fact that it existed at all signaled something deeper. The idea of Indian nationhood was already under strain. The British, meanwhile, were more than willing to exploit these divisions. In 1909, they introduced separate electorates for Muslims, ostensibly to protect minority interests, but in practice, it encouraged communities to vote by religion. The 1919 Montagu-Chelmsford reforms deepened this, creating a system where political identity became entwined with religious identity. The British had yoked together 100 kingdoms and peoples, but they never quite forged a single nation. Still, the call for independence grew louder, and movements like Gandhi's non-cooperation campaign pulled people into streets, jails, and hunger strikes. There was something electric in the air, a belief that, perhaps, India could be free. But even then, that freedom wore different masks. To some, it meant a secular India where all faiths lived as equals. To others, it meant protecting one's own from the shadows of marginalization. The jewel sparkled, but you had to look closely to see the cracks, growing longer with each year. If the British built the House of India, it was with walls already marked by old paint, layers of trust and betrayal between its communities. Hindu-Muslim relations had long fluctuated between coexistence and confrontation, but in the 19th and early 20th centuries, something began to shift. What had once been local disputes over land, festivals, or pride began morphing into broader, communal narratives. And fear, always a quiet companion, started speaking louder. The colonial administration, though claiming neutrality, did little to ease the tensions. In fact, they often poured oil on smoldering fires. British officers routinely played off communities against each other to maintain control, rewarding loyalty with land, titles, or administrative power. The policy of divide and rule wasn't written on official paper, but it echoed in every decision that set communities apart. Religious festivals became flashpoints. In towns across northern India, clashes over music near mosques or temple processions blocking roads escalated into riots. From the late 1800s onward, cities like Kanpur, Calcutta, and Bombay saw waves of violence. Blood ran in alleyways where children once played. These weren't just random eruptions, they were symptoms of something deeper, a communal consciousness forming, shaped by political competition and historical memory. The 1920s and 1930s hardened these lines. Hindu nationalist organizations like the Hindu Mahasabha began calling for a more assertive Hindu identity. In response, Muslim leaders, feeling increasingly cornered, strengthened calls for solidarity among their own. The two communities were like dancers who no longer moved in rhythm, watching each other's steps with suspicion instead of trust. Language, too, became a battleground. In the north, the debate over Hindi versus Urdu grew fierce. One was seen as the tongue of Hindus, the other of Muslims. Debates over school instruction and government use were no longer just academic. They were perceived as fights over cultural survival. Amid all this, the British continued to tinker with political reforms. But each reform was like adding beams to a crumbling structure without fixing its foundation. The 1935 Government of India Act introduced provincial autonomy, allowing Indian leaders to govern certain regions. When Congress won most of these elections in 1937, they offered few roles to Muslim League members. To many Muslims, it felt like confirmation of their worst fears, a Hindu majority ruling unchecked. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, once a strong advocate for Hindu-Muslim unity, was quietly transforming. The man who had worked closely with Gandhi during the Lucknow Pact in 1916, an agreement symbolizing communal cooperation, was now growing distant. He saw a future where Muslims might be outvoted, outshouted, and outmaneuvered in a democratic India. And in politics, perception often creates reality. The growing divide wasn't only about religion, it was about identity, representation, and survival. Many Hindus saw India as a natural homeland, tied to ancient civilization. But for many Muslims, especially in northern provinces, their history in India was different. They didn't see themselves as newcomers, but neither did they feel safe being governed by a majority that didn't fully trust them. The idea of two nations wasn't born overnight. But by the end of the 1930s, it had entered the political bloodstream. The wounds from riots, the bitterness from exclusion, and the rhetoric from both sides had made it seem not just possible, but perhaps necessary. Faith, once a personal path, was now becoming a line drawn across maps and hearts. By the early 1940s, the Indian independence movement had grown into a massive, churning force, unstoppable, loud, and filled with both promise and peril. But within it were two very different visions for the country's future. On one side stood the Indian National Congress, led by Gandhi, Nehru, and Patel, believing in a secular, united India where religion played no part in citizenship. On the other stood Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the Muslim League, who had begun to argue that Muslims constituted a separate nation altogether. This wasn't always the case. Gandhi and Jinnah had once shared the same political space. Jinnah, early in his career, had been celebrated as the ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity. But the camaraderie had faded. Gandhi's moral politics, rooted in village simplicity, khadi cloth, and civil disobedience, clashed with Jinnah's sharp legalism and urban, constitutional mindset. More than that, Jinnah felt that Congress paid only lip service to Muslim interests, using the language of unity while sidelining Muslim voices in practice. As Indian politics matured, so did the divides. The 1937 elections were a turning point. Congress's refusal to form coalition governments with the Muslim League in key provinces sent a chilling message. To Jinnah and many Muslims, it meant a future India where Hindus would wield unchecked power. The League's popularity surged. Jinnah began pushing a more radical idea, that Muslims were not just a religious group, but a nation deserving of its own state. In 1940, at the League's annual session in Lahore, Jinnah unveiled the two-nation theory with clarity. The Lahore Resolution, often retroactively called the Pakistan Resolution, declared that Muslims in India were a nation entitled to separate homelands. It was a dramatic, irreversible shift. From that moment on, partition wasn't just a whisper, it was a formal demand. Gandhi, meanwhile, could not accept the idea of dividing India. He saw it as a spiritual betrayal, a scar on the soul of a country that had always been pluralistic. He walked barefoot through villages, fasted, and prayed for unity. But Gandhi's vision, while powerful, was rooted in idealism. Jinnah's was political realism, sharpened by years of exclusion and fear. Nehru, too, struggled with the League's demand. He believed that secular democracy would protect all citizens, regardless of religion. But the Congress's repeated inability to assure Muslim leaders of true representation only strengthened the League's resolve. The chasm widened. The British watched all this with a mix of fatigue and calculation. After World War I, they had promised reforms, only to delay and dilute them. The result? Frustration and radicalization. The Quit India movement in 1942 saw thousands jailed, but it also showed the British that India could no longer be governed indefinitely. Independence was no longer a question of if, it was a question of how. And now, that how was wrapped in competing dreams. Congress wanted a united India. The League wanted a divided one. The people, millions of them, waited in uncertainty. In towns and cities, whispers of future borders began to circulate. Muslims in Hindu-majority areas wondered, would they be safe? Hindus in Muslim-majority regions asked the same. The independence movement, once a shared struggle, had split into parallel tracks. The soil of nationalism had grown two trees, one reaching toward unity, the other toward separation. And beneath both, the roots tangled in a deepening fear of what the future might bring. As the 1940s wore on, global tremors reached the Indian subcontinent in force. World War II was not just a European crisis. It shattered empires, bankrupted Britain, and changed colonial relationships forever. In India, the war years fanned both desperation and opportunity. The British, locked in a life-or-death struggle against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, needed India's support. But India's leaders saw leverage. In 1942, the Congress Party launched the Quit India movement, demanding an immediate end to British rule. The British response was swift and brutal. Gandhi, Nehru, and thousands more were jailed. But while Congress leaders languished in prison, the Muslim League saw an opening. Jinnah cooperated with the British war effort, strategically positioning the League as a responsible, stable alternative to Congress. The war that fractured Europe was quietly fracturing India's political balance as well. By the time the war ended in 1945, Britain was exhausted. The empire had won the war but lost the will to rule. Economically shattered, politically cornered, and facing rising unrest in colonies across the globe, British leaders understood the clock was ticking on their imperial ambitions. India, the crown jewel, would have to be let go, but not without a plan. And that's where things grew complicated. Elections were held in 1946 to form a constituent assembly that would draft India's new constitution. The results were telling. Congress won a sweeping majority in general constituencies, but the Muslim League triumphed in Muslim-reserved seats. This stark polarization confirmed the worst fears of both camps. It wasn't just a disagreement over governance, it was now a question of identity. That same year, the British proposed a plan for a united India with grouped provinces, a sort of federal arrangement that might satisfy both sides. Congress rejected the groupings. Jinnah, now fully convinced that Muslims would never receive fair treatment in a Hindu-majority India, called for a nationwide protest. August 16, 1946, became known as Direct Action Day. What began as a political demonstration in Calcutta erupted into horror. Hindu and Muslim mobs clashed violently for days. Thousands were killed. Streets ran red. The police stood by, helpless or complicit. The City of Joy had become a nightmare. And what happened in Calcutta didn't stay in Calcutta. Riots spread across Bengal, Bihar, Punjab, Anywhere Hindus and Muslims lived in close quarters, fear now did the speaking. The British, alarmed and uncertain, scrambled for a solution. In early 1947, they sent Lord Louis Mountbatten to India as the last viceroy. His task was clear: hand over power, fast. Mountbatten was young, charming, and decisive. But even he could see the house was already burning. Negotiations between Congress, the League, and the British hit dead ends. Gandhi urged unity. Nehru warned of chaos. Jinnah stood firm: no Pakistan, no peace. Mountbatten, realizing that a single, united India was now a fantasy, proposed partition. It was a decision born not of strategy, but surrender. Britain had neither the will nor the means to enforce unity. The war had drained them dry. And so, in the spring of 1947, as the monsoons approached, the decision was made. India would be split. Two nations would rise from the ashes of empire, India and Pakistan. But no one yet knew the true cost of that line. The summer of 1947 arrived not with celebration, but with dread. Everyone knew change was coming, but no one could imagine how violent, chaotic, and permanent that change would be. At the center of this impending storm stood a man with no experience in India, no knowledge of its languages or geography, and just 5 weeks to divide a subcontinent: Sir Cyril Radcliffe. Radcliffe, a British lawyer, had never set foot in India before being asked to draw the boundaries between two nations. He was given a map, population data, a vague set of principles, and almost no time. His job was to separate Hindus and Muslims as neatly as possible, especially in the heavily mixed regions of Punjab and Bengal. But in India, people didn't live in clean blocks of religion. They were interwoven, house by house, field by field. No line could be clean. Meanwhile, Mountbatten accelerated the timetable. Originally, the British had planned to leave in 1948. But fearing a total collapse of order, he moved the deadline up to August 15, 1947. The effect was devastating. There was no time for careful planning, for troop deployments, for evacuation. The house was already on fire, and now the exits were being sealed with the blaze still roaring. The Radcliffe Line, as it came to be known, was drawn in hurried silence. No public consultations. No debates. Only a handful of officials knew the final borders before independence. And when they were finally revealed, 2 days after both nations had declared independence, it was already too late. People had cheered on August 14th and 15th, waving flags and dancing in the streets. But soon after, the shock arrived. A village that thought it was in India was now in Pakistan. A city that had prepared to be part of Pakistan woke up in India. Confusion turned to panic. What followed was one of the largest and bloodiest mass migrations in human history. Nearly 15 million people were forced to leave their homes and cross new borders based on religious identity. Trains packed with refugees moved in both directions, but many never made it. Entire trains arrived filled only with corpses. Caravans of families trudged through heat and dust, attacked by mobs along the way. Women were kidnapped, assaulted, or worse. Children were orphaned. The scale of violence defied imagination. Punjab, once the land of 5 rivers and brotherhood, became a slaughterhouse. In Bengal, the eastern border fared little better. Neighbors turned on neighbors. The air reeked of smoke from burning homes. Gurudwaras, mosques, and temples became both shelters and targets. The line on the map may have been thin, but it cut through families, friendships, and centuries of shared history. And yet, amidst the horror, were acts of astonishing bravery. People risked their lives to shelter others of different faiths. Train drivers made detours to avoid riots. Villagers formed human chains to protect convoys. Partition revealed the worst in humanity, but not only the worst. Cyril Radcliffe, devastated by what he had unknowingly unleashed, refused his payment for the work and left India, never to return. Mountbatten, too, was shaken, though history remains divided on his role. Was he a pragmatist who prevented worse, or a hasty agent of collapse? The partition had happened. India and Pakistan were born, but not from celebration. From compromise, from fear, from a line drawn too fast through land too complex for people who deserved more time to say goodbye. In the months that followed partition, the land trembled, not from earthquakes, but from the echo of footsteps, of wheels grinding over cracked roads, of voices crying out for lost loved ones. Across India and the newly formed Pakistan, people were on the move, millions of them, walking, fleeing, searching. What had begun as a political solution had become a human catastrophe. The refugee trains became symbols of both hope and horror. A train leaving Lahore might be filled with Hindus and Sikhs hoping to reach Delhi. A train from Amritsar might carry Muslims heading to Karachi. But often they never made it. Attacks were timed with dreadful precision. Trains would arrive at stations not with joyful reunions, but with eerie silence, every soul on board massacred. Bloodied saris fluttered like torn flags. Turbans lay strewn across the floors. And always the question, how did it come to this? Entire towns were emptied. In places like Rawalpindi, once bustling with Hindu families, silence fell. In Lahore, Muslims flooded and even as Sikhs were driven out. The same happened in reverse across Indian Punjab. Property was abandoned, livestock left behind, and temples and mosques desecrated in the frenzy. What had taken generations to build unraveled in weeks. Gandhi, frail and heartbroken, tried to hold the country together with nothing more than his presence. He fasted in Calcutta to quell riots, walking through burning streets with only prayer as his shield. In Delhi, he visited Muslim neighborhoods, urging Hindus to protect their neighbors. He was the last voice of unity in a world falling apart. But even Gandhi's resolve could not stop the tide. On January 30, 1948, just months after independence, he was assassinated by a Hindu extremist, angry at Gandhi's pleas for peace and reconciliation with Muslims. The man who had fought so long for a united India was felled by the very hate he had opposed all his life. The politics of the subcontinent hardened. Pakistan, born as a homeland for Muslims, struggled with its own internal divides, between East and West Pakistan, between secularists and Islamists. India, declaring itself secular, faced decades of tension with its new neighbor. Kashmir, a princely state caught between both, became a wound that still bleeds. And yet, even in the shadow of partition, life went on. Refugees built new homes. Cities like Delhi and Karachi expanded overnight. Children born in refugee camps grew into leaders, artists, teachers. The scar didn't heal, but people learned to live around it. Today, the partition of India is often remembered in numbers: 15 million displaced, more than 1 million dead, countless others scarred. But those numbers cannot tell the whole story. They don't show you the mother who left behind a child in the chaos, the farmer who buried his friend of another faith, the letters never delivered, the songs never sung again in villages that no longer existed. What led to partition wasn't just politics, it was fear, mistrust, and a tragic failure to imagine coexistence. It was also colonial negligence, a rushed retreat, and the poisonous allure of drawing lines to solve problems. But history rarely moves with clean hands. The ghosts of partition still walk the border. They whisper in the barbed wire, in the train tracks, in the silence between neighbors who once shared more than just a land, they shared a life. And maybe, one day, the story of partition won't only be a tale of loss, but also of what it means to remember, and to hope, across those lines.